The world has developed tremendously in the last few centuries. But along with this feat, the disparity between the rich and the poor have also widened. Poor Economics, written by authors Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, focuses on numerous aspects of poverty and why people stay trapped in the poverty cycle today. Today, I will be focusing on Chapter 4, titled Education Top of the Class. Education is an aspect that was widely respected since ancient times. For example, during the Han Dynasty from 206 BC to 220 CE, the civil service exam, which required scholars to be greatly educated before taking it, allowed people to move up the social ladder. This chapter outlines that the main problem isn't about children having access to education, but rather how efficient these schools and students can be. According to the interviews done by ABC News Australia, one of the biggest problems with education in rural areas is the poor attendance records among students.
School attendance is a real concern.
Attendance figures, and particularly in high school, have actually got worse over the 2 years we've reported on. And I think clearly children that are not attending school are going to have not only bad education outcomes, but it will flow into health and employment as well.
One significant problem involves the supply and demand of education. When education is demanded and shifts the demand curve to the right, this will also allow the supply curve to shift to the right as governments need to supply more education to meet the demands. However, this can only happen if the parents of the students who are actually investing in the education finds a need to send their children to school, or students finding a need to be the ones staying in school. What do you think the main reasons are for the high dropout rates in rural areas?
I think high dropout rates in rural areas and even in urban centers typically revolves around lack of opportunity. So I think if students and families don't see the direct correlation between school and school success and then work and income, then they're less inclined to stay in school, because once you've fulfilled your whatever the obligatory age is, right, whether it's 14 or 16, once you've done that, then you feel like, okay, if I'm not going to be getting any longer term benefits, then I can start working now. And if people, especially in rural communities, are living, like if they're doing like subsistence farming, or if they're working in factories and they can already start that work, then they're seeing their labor manifest itself into currency, as opposed to staying in school, which is like, well, what's going to happen? It's not like I'm going to do anything else other than farm and or be in factories or these other jobs that I don't need to finish school for. So unless that connection is made in terms of outcome, then people will probably be less likely to stay in school.
Okay, yeah. Like my interviewee has mentioned, many families trapped in poverty are very uncertain about their future, and they don't see immediate returns of education. They may believe that the opportunity cost of having an education is in fact earning money through part-time jobs. Furthermore,
जो financial sound नहीं होते, and उसका सबसे बड़ा like thing problem यही हो जाता है कि they can't take risk. वो लोग risk नहीं ले सकते. ऐसे उनकी family की size ही बहुत बड़ी होती है. So if they take like 1% के लिए risk लेते हैं, तो बाकी बहुत ज़्यादा लोग affect होते हैं इस चक्कर में.
For girls, families may find it more beneficial to send their child off to marry rather than acquire an education. This is told through Shati's story, who has experienced child marriage and also used her experience to allow children to get education as well.
Shati is helping her 14-year-old sister-in-law get ready for school. At the age of 14, Shati was no longer going to school. Her parents gave her away in marriage. Shati had her first child at the age of 15. Shati has also used her voice to stop early marriage at home. Now her daughter and sister-in-law will have the opportunities she lost.
আমার অল্প বয়সে বিবাহ হয়েছে, আমার অনেক অসুবিধা হয়েছে, এবং বাচ্চা পোলাপান বেশি হয়েছে, পালতে আমার কষ্ট হয়েছে। এবং আমার একটা মেয়ে আছে, এখন আমি অল্প বয়সে বিয়ে দেব না, লেখাপড়া করাবো।
আর মেয়ের মনে করেন বাল্যবিবাহ তো আমি দেবো না, তারপর মেয়ের ভবিষ্যৎ করতেছি, পড়ালেখার চিন্তা, পড়ালেখা শেষ করবো, তারপর মেয়ের বিবাহ।
The story of Shahina from Bangladesh also shows this big issue.
Shahina once dreamt of completing her school education and one day becoming a teacher. But when Shahina was 14 years old, she was forced into married life instead and started living and working in her in-laws' home.
আমার বাপের বাড়িতে কিছু করিনি, শুধু স্কুলে যেতাম আর পড়তাম। এটা এখানে তো সংসারে সব কাজ করতে হচ্ছে। সকালে উঠি, নামাজ পড়ি, তারপর ঘর ঝাড়ু দিই, তারপর নাস্তা তৈরি করতে হয়, তারপর ভাত রান্না করতে হয়, তরকারি করতে হয়, হাঁড়ি পাতি মাজতে হয়, গরুকে ঘাস দিতে হয়। আমি অবসর সময় টুপি সেলাই করি। স্কুলে যেতাম, ক্লাস 9 থেকে আমার বিয়ে হয়ে গেছে। তার হয়নি, আমার আম্মু বকা দিচ্ছে, গালি দিচ্ছে, জন্য হয়ে গেছে। আমার ইচ্ছে ছিল যে আমি ক্লাস 9 থেকে 10 উঠবো, আমার পরীক্ষা দিব, এটাই ইচ্ছে ছিল।
Additionally, to the children who are from the lower class in society, teachers may invest less time and effort into these students and invest more time and effort into the wealthy or ones with potential. Through my research, I found that another big reasons why like people don't really like to stay in school is because of like the, I guess, supply side of it. So basically like teachers are very discriminatory against like the wealthy, I guess, and the like non-wealthy. They'll only push the ones who clearly have a lot more money than others. So I was also wondering if you know anything about this.
Well, for much of, and I'm thinking you're talking about like public schools in the US. Okay, so public schools are so outdated in the way that they are formulated, right? Like even the way that the school year runs, right? Like the reason why it was created the way it was so that kids would have time to go home and harvest and help and so on. In the creation of the school system as well, it was like, you know, they were only really trying to educate 10 to 20% of the population. The rest of it was to just get people enough knowledge so that they would be good factory workers, right? And so if you don't modernize, and if that's not, if the thought behind why we do school the way we do doesn't evolve and change, then obviously people aren't going to want to invest their time and interest in there, especially if they're trying to monetize. And so I think, yeah, it makes complete sense that, you know, teachers are only pushing a certain percentage of their students because that's what the system was intended to do. So the American public education system is working as designed, where there's only a small select population that's going off to university or college, and the rest are going into menial, you know, labor or whatnot. So that doesn't surprise me at all.
Recently, a big problem in India, specifically in the Bimaru states, is the rising dropout levels of students. Bimaru is an acronym for the following states shown on the screen. First post states the following quote. This can also be seen with minority groups in multiple countries, such as one of Amber Johnston and Judy Sarden's house.
I started realizing that maybe we hadn't come as far along in race relations in the country as I thought that we had, that there seemed to be a lot of messed up stuff brewing underneath. And I was feeling very much like a mama bear, like, hey, I don't know exactly what's going down here, but I'm not willing to sacrifice my child as I try to figure this out.
It was 2012. Sarden says then 4-year-old Aiden had a tough year with one teacher in his Montessori class.
My son was reading at the time. He was young, but he was reading. And the other teachers had pushed him. Anything he showed an aptitude for, they had pushed him and helped him to develop it in a way that he enjoyed it. But this teacher, who had come from the public schools, didn't. And I begged her to, I sent her books to school that he was reading and asked her to encourage him and have him read to her, and she never did. There was no expectation that he should be able to read. And I could see kind of, the writing on the wall. I could see where we were going with his education, with him regressing the way he did that one year. It was drastic, and it was heartbreaking.
This raises the issue of self-fulfilling prophecy as well, since the teacher's actions and belief towards the students will affect them. The lack of educators may also be a big problem.
There was a classroom next door. It was a secondary classroom. And I remember walking into it one day, and there were about 30 kids all on top of each other, and there was no class, there was no teacher. So I went and asked my principal, what's up with that class? And she's like, so we don't have a teacher, but we'll probably get somebody by the end of the year, and so they'll be fine. So I'm like, what till then? She's like, no, we'll figure it out, people can substitute and all of that. And that image just stuck in my head. I'm like, how can you have a classroom with no teacher?
So, what can be done about this issue? So, what do you think, what do you think can be done about this? Do you think it should be more of governments implementing more policies or investing more into education, or do you think it's some other factors that should be altered in order to fix this issue?
I think it's and both, right? So I think that there are systems at play, like the design of public school education, right? Like, what are its funding sources? Who benefits and who doesn't? All of those things need to be looked at and reassessed when thinking about the success of whether education is given the right opportunity and platform to transform lives, which it can do.
Yeah.
But I think the myth that if you work hard and if you're really smart and or you work really hard, you're going to be able to go to that next great institution and get that next job. And so that those stories, the Horatio Alger stories of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and being able to do that through education, I think they're myths and not reality. I think the way that the American education system is currently structured is such that those who have and those who have access to continue to have access to, and those who don't, unless they are a part of a very small percentage that works 3, 4, 5 times as hard, they're not getting noticed and they're not advancing. It's, if you look at statistics around the diversity of applicants who are being accepted into top tier universities, you'll notice that the populations remain about the same each year. If you look even for 10 years ago, what the population of Black students at Harvard was, and you look at it yesterday, they're pretty much in line. If you look at the statistics around who's on financial aid from 10 years ago at Princeton, it's about the same percentage that's on financial aid now. I mean, and that's not just because there's only 22% of the population who deserves it. It's because they have been intentional about keeping those structures in place. So I think that there's some of that at play. I also think about how students are supported once they are in academic institutions, right? I'm thinking about support services. If you are bringing low income or socioeconomically disadvantaged folks into spaces that have been primarily occupied by wealthy individuals, what are the resource differences? What are the resource gaps, right? Probably those people with lots of money have had access to tutoring. They've had access to computers and technology. They've had access to networking, trips, language, instruments, equipment, right? And so if someone is coming into a well-resourced position from one that isn't well-resourced, there's going to be a huge gap. And if I come into that space every day realizing that I don't have the sweatshirt that you do, and I don't have the laptop that you do, and I don't have the tutoring and the background and the relationships with teachers that you do, I'm disincentivized to come to school because I feel less than. Every instance of interaction becomes another opportunity for me to feel less than. right? And there are obviously people who will use that to motivate them, or for some people who that won't bother them, but for the vast majority of people who have feelings, it has to influence them. So I think it's not just about legislation, but also thinking about how we are supporting and really facilitating the development. So like one of the things that a lot of universities are doing now, and I say now, but probably starting in the last 3 to 5 years, you'll see that there are lots of like first generation programs happening at universities. So at Stanford, where I went, like there were clubs specific to first generation students, and what they sought to do was, because our parents didn't go to university in the States or at all, there were things that we just didn't know about, right? And so it was an opportunity to network with other folks that had gone through and sort of say, okay, so when you're doing your FAFSA, which is your financial aid form, here are some things you need to think about, right? And you have to do it by this date, and this is how you do it, right? Whereas people who had parents who've gone to college, more likely than not, they're not completing FAFSA, but also if they are, they've at least seen it before, they're familiar with it, they know how to get those documents and so on. And so it becomes a wealth of information that's being shared. And I think those kinds of supports, so like affinity groups, if you're an underrepresented or minoritized group, that help you see yourself, it reflected in that space, as opposed to, okay, it's just for those kinds of people who are different from me and I don't really belong here and I'm an imposter and all those things. So I think it's both the structural, so the policy, but then it's also the supportive, intangible parts that need to change to cut the gap.
Furthermore, a study found by Citigroup helps us understand how behavioral economics can help solve this issue by stating the following quote shown on the screen. One example would be, by increasing exposure of the education people are getting in rural areas, this may allow the families to believe that the risks are worth it, since this takes advantage of humans being social creatures.